Good evening.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Doesn't matter.
My name is Christopher Wilton-Steer. I'm the Head of Communications at the Aga Khan Foundation. It's a pleasure to have you all here this evening at the Aga Khan Center. Before I introduce the session and the speakers, some housekeeping. We're not planning any fire drills, so if you hear an alarm, please make your way through the atrium, down the stairs, and out of the building. We'll be recording the session this evening, so if you'd like to watch it again or to share it, you'll be able to. And lastly, this talk will be followed by a reception. We hope you'll join us for that afterwards. I'd also like to welcome our online audience. Sorry not to invite you to the reception. The Aga Khan Foundation are delighted to host this important and timely talk this evening in partnership with UK for UNHCR. UNHCR is the UN refugee agency which is dedicated to saving lives, protecting rights, and building a better future for refugees, forcibly displaced communities, and stateless people. Like UNHCR, AKF work globally to improve the quality of life for marginalized communities. In Afghanistan, we are present in all 16 provinces and are currently providing humanitarian relief for millions of Afghans alongside our ongoing social programs. Roughly 3.4 million people are now displaced by conflict inside Afghanistan, and today almost 23 million people are facing extreme hunger. Afghanistan is currently experiencing one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. To explore ways that we can respond to this crisis and to the critical needs of Afghans, we have with us this evening 5 esteemed panelists. Emma Cherniavsky is the founding CEO of UK for UNHCR. Emma has more than 20 years of experience in fundraising and senior management in the non-profit sector and in politics. Emma will be our chair this evening. Matt Reed is the Global Director of Institutional Partnerships for the Aga Khan Foundation. Matt coordinates all of AKF's work with bilateral, multilateral, foundation and corporate partners worldwide. Previously, he worked at the Getty Research Institute, the Salzburg Seminar, and the MacArthur Foundation. Matt was recently in Kabul, so we look forward to hearing his thoughts from that trip shortly. Dialing in from Geneva is Babar Baloch. Babar has worked for UNHCR for more than 10 years, largely as a senior spokesperson. He has worked from many conflict zones, including most recently Afghanistan. We are also delighted to have Christina Lamb with us. Christina is one of Britain's leading foreign correspondents and a best-selling author. She has reported from most of the world's hotspots, including Afghanistan. She is currently chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times of London and is particularly known for her writing highlighting how war affects women. Christina has won 15 major awards, including Europe's top war reporting prize, the Prix Bayeux. She was made an OBE by the Queen in 2013. Unfortunately, the Afghan writer and social entrepreneur Zalasht Halamzai couldn't be with us this evening due to a personal emergency. We send her our best wishes. At short notice, however, we are very grateful to have Ilaha Omar join us online. Ilaha is the co-founder and executive director of Uplift Afghanistan Fund, an umbrella fund focused on responding to the unfolding impending crises in Afghanistan. Ilaha is also the director and advisory council member of Enabled Children Initiative, a non-profit supporting orphaned and abandoned special needs children in Afghanistan, and is a member of the US Afghan Women's Council. Emma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Christopher, and thank you so much, Matt, to you and your colleagues for having us here this evening. So the format for the evening is that we're going to hear from each of our panelists. I will ask a few questions of each of them, and then we will have time for questions and answer at the end, so I encourage all of you to think of some questions for that last portion of the evening. UK for UNHCR is the national charity partner for UNHCR here in the UK, and our mission is to connect the UK public to the work of UNHCR and the global refugee cause. We want to help you and other members of the public in the UK have an impact on the lives of refugees. I think we're all here tonight because we stand in solidarity with refugees. The global displacement crisis is in an unprecedented place. We have 82 million people worldwide who are now displaced. And for me, this recently became a very personal thing. My brother and his family were living in Kiev for the last 12 years and recently themselves became displaced. And while my brother was among the lucky ones with a foreign passport to leave peacefully on a commercial flight with his family, it's been devastating for me, having been to Ukraine many times and seeing the impact on him and his family of having lost their home in the country that they love. So, but here we are tonight to think about another very, very challenging crisis, and that's in Afghanistan. I think in both instances, in Afghanistan and in Ukraine, the speed and the scale of these emergencies reflects the acceleration of what we are seeing with global displacement worldwide. And that's something that I know our panelists will help us reflect on this evening. As we heard from Christopher, Afghanistan is one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with more than 23 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 3.5 million people in the country internally displaced, and millions who have crossed the border and become refugees in Iran, in Pakistan, and in many other countries around the world. The response of the UK public has been extraordinarily generous, and I know many of you here tonight have assisted UNHCR, have helped the Aga Khan Foundation with our life-saving work with refugees and with people in Afghanistan. I think we have to work hard to keep the world's attention on the crisis, and that's why we're here this evening. And now I would like to turn to our panelists to share their thoughts and views with us. I'm going to start with Babar in Geneva. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And could you start by telling us about your recent trip to Afghanistan and just your impressions of how the situation there has evolved since the events of August?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. It's really an honor to be in this gathering. And also, Christina and I have been, working alongside in places. We were at the same time covering the events of post-August 2021, but before that, even 2015 and 17, when I was posted in Budapest with UNHCR's regional office there, we had been working on kind of covering displacement. And I mean, what was just said, it kind of demonstrates what war does to you, to humanity, to human beings. We know our world can turn upside down. We kind of keep repeating this phrase quite often, and it happens to us. And when it happens, we lose everything. Afghans have been going through it for the last 40 years. 4 decades is not a short time. Now what we are seeing unfolding in Ukraine is another heartbreaking evidence of what happens to human beings. The best thing is, like all of us and all of you who have gathered today together, is that you care. There's humanity, there's compassion, and that's how humanity have survived many, many crises, emergencies, wars, for ages. I mean, not for centuries, but this tradition of caring for other human beings has been always there. I've been covering Afghanistan for last 20 years now, 2 decades. My first trip to Kabul was back in May 2002 with UNHCR when I left journalism back in Balochistan in Pakistan and joined UNHCR. So that was the initial few months when Taliban had left and when people were going back home. So I was in Kabul. Part of me was kind of very uncomfortable then, because there was a lot of Afghans that were returning home in hope of a new beginning. 2002 saw 1.8 million Afghan refugees that were outside the country went back home. And I had this uneasy feeling that what are people returning to? Why are they coming back home? And I mean, whole Kabul was in shutters, and still people wanted to be home. And then in the later years, we saw the effort to rebuild, restart life. For many, it was an attempt to start from scratch. And that's when you saw in the following years, I saw the signs of children going back to school, boys and girls alike. So that brought the smiles on our faces. The last trip I did there was in October, November, and that was not so kind of pleasant as my previous trips over there. The sense of desperation, destitution is on the rise. As it was referenced, half of Afghanistan's, more than half of Afghanistan's population of 40 million needs humanitarian assistance. But as Christina just recently wrote in one of her articles, 96% Afghans are those who don't have enough to eat. Imagine just 4% are those who have some food, and for rest of it, there's just nothing. And this was very, very kind of obvious when we walked around in terms of our aid distribution centers that UNHCR runs, not only in Kabul, in many other parts of the country. Even before the Taliban takeover in August, there were 18 million people that were relying on humanitarian assistance, on UNHCR and others that we were supporting. That number rose to 24 million. So we have 6 million people added. But it's not talking about just the numbers. I mean, just look at its impact on ordinary human beings. Standing now in the queues of aid distribution are those who, before the events of August 2021, had some kind of income. You had a job, some source of income, even businesses. So that's not there anymore. So those Afghans, even if you have your money in the bank and you cannot access it now to kind of get something, some food to eat, you have to find it. You have to find a way. We met a single mothers who had actually lost her husband in the fighting because husband was a former security officer or who was killed in fighting with the Taliban. She has three children. The youngest was 3 months old, a son. Eldest was a son, 13, and then in the middle there was a daughter, 10 years old. Once the husband died, she was not in Kabul. She had fled to Kabul in search of safety, but also before that, she went to all other places of support that she can ask people. So she went to relatives, she went to her brothers, and everyone was saying, listen, we cannot take care of you and your children. So she ended up with her 2 elderly parents and 3 kids. So now, as we support her, she also has to work. And this work is not normal work. I mean, you try to find something you can do to sustain your life. And she has to send her son to find plastic refuse. And same with the daughter, the 10-year-old. And there are many other horrible stories that you have read and seen in the news. It's all true. This is what Afghans are going through right now. And that's where this urge of asking people, don't forget Afghanistan. Our High Commissioner, Filippo Grandi, was just there last week. He was there after the Taliban takeover. He went now just to remind people that Afghanistan is a crisis that has been there for the last 40 years. It's getting worse. It's not improving. So if we look away, Afghans would have to go through many, many other episodes of suffering. That's why I was saying, remember, last time when the Taliban were there and the world started to look away, look what happened. This time, Afghans cannot afford it. We have to be there in terms of bringing our support. So my colleagues, UNHCR, are on the ground. We are working in many districts and provinces of Afghanistan. But we need support. So our ability to assist and bring help to people depends on what we receive in terms of humanitarian assistance and support. Just to cut it short, the UNHCR, we need 340 million to help Afghans this year. So far, we have received under 30% of that money. The UN and the humanitarian community overall needs 4.5 billion. This is the single largest amount required for a single country that UN has asked for. This appeal was launched in January. Till now, it's just 13% funded. So Afghans need our support, and they need it right now. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Babar, for sharing that with us. And I wonder, just as one follow-up question, if you could tell us a little bit more about how UNHCR has responded sort of operationally, in this crisis. How do we scale up our operations on the ground?
So UNHCR has a strong footprint in Afghanistan and in the neighboring countries. So the last time the Soviet troops entered, our engagement started with Afghanistan and Afghan people, not in the neighboring countries and inside Afghanistan. For the last 20 years, we were engaged in terms of a large number of refugees that had gone back for the last two decades. So UNHCR helped more than 5 million for former Afghan refugees to return home. We were already involved with people who were displaced internally. Remember, the last 20 years, as better they were, conflict did not stop there. There were more and more Afghans that were being displaced. The only difference was this time more Afghans were being displaced inside their country rather leaving Afghanistan. Even same after the events of August 2021, more have been displaced inside Afghanistan rather than leaving the country. I mean, we have 2.2 million Afghan refugees who live in the neighboring countries and beyond. But the reality is 3.4 million Afghans are displaced inside the country. Nearly 800,000 Afghans became displaced last year. 80% of them were women and children. So our project in terms of bringing support to former refugees, those who were already displaced were already there. And when we all witnessed the horrifying events when it started to appear on our TV screens from Kabul airport, which were brought live. And after that, what happened when everyone just kind of had to leave. We were still there. We stayed. We helped. We had to bring in supplies through road from Pakistan, from Central Asia. It took us a long while because of the way things were. We could not fly in support. When I was there in October, we got our first airlift that we arranged inside the country. And this was with all the difficulties that we have had with Taliban coming in, Kabul airport not being operational. Now supplies are getting in. We are distributing aid. We are going house to house, district to district, province to province to find those who are the most desperate and vulnerable. The problem is that as we find them and help, there are more who need our assistance. Our assistance from daily household items to food, to give money to people to build their shelters, to spend on their daily livings. It comes in different shapes, but we have been there, and what we see is that sense of desperation and destitution is just increasing manifolds day by day.
Thank you, Babar, and I hope we can come back to you to share more reflections when we come to the questions. I want to turn now to Matt, who also has recently returned from Afghanistan, and to just share with us your reflections from that trip.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks everyone for coming tonight. I mean, I want to pick up on what Babar said, which is this, the overwhelming feeling that I had when I met with our staff and the people there was this message of don't forget us. I think you can't overestimate the sense of abandonment that people felt and feel in Afghanistan, especially the people that we've been working with, the people whose hopes we have been feeding for 20 years. All of a sudden, the international community overnight said, we're stopping assistance. We're encouraging you to get on those planes, get out, evacuate, etc. And so for the colleagues who are left there, there's a visceral sense for them of, well, what is the message you're sending about our country and about us who have stayed or had to stay, who can't get out? And so I think all of them had that feeling. And what they wanted to know was that there were people like all of us in this room who are thinking about them, who want to make a difference and want to help. And so their second message to me was over and over again, please give us the tools so that we can do our jobs and help people. Because I think for the foundation, which has gone through some challenging times in the last 6 months, to say the least, which I can say a bit more about in a second, we're in a position now where we have been able to maintain our footprint of operations in 8 provinces. We have roughly 35 district offices, 5 regional offices. We've been able to maintain most of our staff, not all, while funding has been paused. And so they are poised to respond. We've been able to respond to the crisis in a variety of ways using internal funds. But as international funding has been frozen, we've had to make a lot of sacrifices so that we could maintain that structure, if you will. But their message to me was, we're ready. We can do much, much more. And as soon as we can solve some of the banking challenges, funding challenges, we can operate. And I think that's the other thing, which is the great irony now, is that in a way that many parts of the country are safer than they have been in decades for work like ours to take place. You can access many, many, many places that you couldn't access before, even the places where we were working before that might have been under Taliban control or that had been live fighting areas on a regular basis. Those areas you can access. But the problem is that as the international community has for the most part frozen its development assistance, and as the banking community has taken an extremely risk-averse posture and frozen most funds going into the country, you have a humanitarian crisis that really has been human-made and created overnight.
And just to expand on that point of the very challenging, obviously, environment that you're referring to, is there more to sort of say about that, and what can be done to try to unlock this cycle?
I mean, just to give you an example of some of the challenges our operation has faced, I'm looking at Lori, who's sitting in the front row here. CARE has faced similar challenges. Every NGO working in the country has faced these challenges. Really within a matter of days, every international partner we worked with said, you have to freeze your assistance. So all of the development work that you've been doing, we want you to freeze that because we don't know, is it sanctions compliant? Is it not sanctions compliant? Will it be supporting the new government? Is it politically correct, et cetera? With some exceptions, some notable exceptions, the European Commission is one of them. For example, we were able to continue some of that work. We had funding of our own that we were able to draw on in country. But then the second challenge that immediately came to bear was that the banking sector stopped making transfers to Afghanistan. It stopped transferring remittances, it stopped transferring donor funding, it stopped transferring humanitarian funding for a very long period of time, almost 3 months. And so during that time, our operation and most operations didn't necessarily, many other operations didn't have the funding to continue. We were in a very fortunate position where we had some internal reserves. We were able to maintain our operations through that period using those internal reserves across the various agencies that the Aga Khan Group operates. Some of you may have seen a statistic that in the first 3 months after August, that about 17% of Afghanistan's health facilities were open. All the rest were closed. We think that about 2/3 of that 17% were facilities that we operated on our own funds, and that we may never get paid back for, but that we were able to keep them open because we had a commitment to the people of the country. However, that said, our resources aren't infinite, and very, very quickly they started to dwindle to a point where we couldn't pay staff. We had to make a choice between paying vendors, people who had done work for us that we owed money, and these are businesses who are supporting families. And we had to make a choice between paying them or paying our own staff. And our staff voted and actually decided not to take salaries for 3 months so that we could pay vendors, support communities, and do that work. It's extraordinary, that sacrifice. How many of us would actually be willing to do that? Not many. Now, we're in a very fortunate position today. We have been able to find a banking channel. We have our bankers over here, Crown Agents Bank, which is working with AIB in the country, and we've been able to open a banking channel to get transfers in, which is literally a lifeline, both for the communities that we're working with, but also for our operations. We're now working with the UN, but these are stopgap measures. What we need is a much more how could I put it, aggressive relaxing, if that's the right word. Not only of the sanctions regimes, but of the kind of overly risk-averse approach of financial institutions for working in the country. It's a major, major problem. And until we do that, we're not going to be able to, A, get in the financial resources for the humanitarian response that UNHCR and others are operating, but we also won't be able to help Afghans help themselves, run their businesses, trade in markets, do all the things that they're perfectly capable of and that we spent 2 decades putting them into a position to do.
And just briefly, what probability would you put on this change happening?
Oh, goodness. Well, I mean, look, there are people in the banking sector who are here, who work inside the sector, who could probably say a bit more. I have to say from the outside, I've not been terribly impressed, with the exception of Crown Agents Bank, at the, I would say, either the risk tolerance, or even, it's not even a risk at this point. You know, the US government, OFAC is what it's called, has made very, very clear that the vast majority of activities in Afghanistan are allowed. And so I think that the global banking community is frankly, how should I put it, is abdicating its humanitarian responsibilities to bank that country. There's no excuse for it. It's very, very clear that if you look at the sanctions regimes, there is no risk as long as you are not transferring money to listed individuals. And there's a long list of them, but it's certainly not 40 million Afghans. And it doesn't cover the kind of things that we're doing.
The central bank's not under sanctions, isn't it?
Well, exactly. So it shouldn't be, but there is a perception that it might be because the Ministry of Finance is run by a listed individual, and that's the big challenge. But OFAC has recently come out to say that actually even transactions that have to go through the central bank or engage with the central bank are allowed.
Thank you, Matt. And moving to you, Christina, I wondered if you could tell us a bit about just your experience of reporting on Afghanistan over the years. And I know it's been a very important part of your career. And what drew you to that country? And just give us a little bit of history.
Well, it's more than 30 years, so it would take a long time. But it's where I started out. As a foreign correspondent, it's a long story, but just to tell it briefly, I was an intern at the Financial Times, and I was invited to a lunch of South Asian politicians, and at that lunch In fact, I wasn't invited. The foreign editor was invited. He couldn't go. At last minute, he looked around for somebody to go, and he said to me, "You're always going on about India," because I travelled in India as a student. So he said, "Why don't you go to this lunch?" So I went. They were expecting the foreign editor. They got the intern, but they were very polite. And I sat next to someone who was the Secretary General of the Pakistan People's Party, which was Benazir Bhutto's party. At that time, Pakistan, this was the late 80s, was under military dictatorship of General Zia, and she was living in exile in London. So this Secretary General asked me if I'd like to interview her. So of course I said yes. So he arranged for me to interview her. The day I interviewed her was the day she announced her engagement to Asif Ali Zardari. So the flat was absolutely full of bouquets of flowers. She then went back to Pakistan. I went to work for Central TV in Birmingham, and one day I came home from work and there was this invitation on my doorstep, which was to her wedding. And actually that changed my life, because I went to that wedding. I'd never been to Pakistan. I fell in love with it. It was fascinating because, of course, anybody that's been to a South Asian wedding will know that they're very colourful. They go for a long time. And Benazir, being Benazir, was really like something out of Arabian Nights. But it was also very political. Like every night after all the ceremonial events, there'd be these gatherings in her house of her political colleagues to talk about how to try and topple the military dictator. So, and I'd never, I'd grown up in England. The most dangerous thing I'd ever done was finding my way home late at night if I missed the last train in London. So I was astonished by meeting all these people who'd been tear-gassed and arrested and tortured, and to try and bring democracy to their country. So I came back to Birmingham and gave him my notice and said I'm going to go live in Pakistan. However, when I went to talk to foreign editors about freelancing in Pakistan, nobody was interested. They all said, General Zia has been there forever, we're not interested. But we are interested in Afghanistan, because at that time it was under Soviet occupation. And interestingly, it was a war that was really covered by freelancers. Lots of news organizations thought it was too risky for their correspondents. So I said, okay, I'll go to Afghanistan. So I ended up going to live in Peshawar and traveling in and out of Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, who were fighting the Russians, or Soviet forces. And I just fell in love with it. I'd never met people who were such storytellers and so proud of their country, and seemed to have values that we'd forgotten, and were so hospitable even though they were incredibly poor. And so it's basically been my passion, really, Afghanistan, ever since. And I'm very sad that I've always wanted to take my son there on holiday, and it's always somehow been at war, or now it's under Taliban, or it's I would love it to be a place where you could just go to on holiday.
And thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's actually inspiring to hear. And what are your reflections on where the country is now, and just sort of adding to what we've heard from Babar and Matt, and do you see sort of hope or a way forward?
Well, by the way, it's really nice to see Babar and be on the panel with him, even if we're not there together in person. So going there, so I went there 2 weeks after the Taliban took over at the beginning of September, and I can't think of any story I have ever covered where things had turned around so quickly, so suddenly, and so much for the worse. I mean, almost all my friends there had either fled or were trying to flee. Every conversation I had with people seemed to end in tears. And people were just in complete shock that, overnight, everything had changed. And And people were saying to me, it would have been better if you'd never come, the West, because you created all these hopes for us and then you've just gone. And I didn't know how to answer people. And it was so weird to see Taliban everywhere, and women sort of disappeared off the streets and everything was closed. Now I was back in January and February, and I have to say it was more normal, like things were open, and you did see some women on the streets, not many walking around. It's really difficult to deal with because, as all the other panelists have said, that it's so harrowing to see the desperate situation that people are living in. And so when I was there earlier this year, I mean, meeting all these people living just in really, really difficult situations. I wrote about one girl I met who was 8-year-old called Fatima, whose family had come from Helmand to Kabul, like lots of people are internally displaced people, and her father had been in an airstrike like 10 years ago and been badly burnt, and so had been transferred to hospital in Kabul, and had to pay for his medical treatment and got into debt. The rest of the family had moved to Kabul to be with him. And when the Taliban took over and foreign aid stopped, you know, this is a country, 75% of the budget came from foreign aid. That all went overnight. Somebody described it to me, it's like a patient getting a blood transfusion and somebody pulling the tube out suddenly. And it's hard to basically really get to grips with, because it's not just that you've got all the foreign aid gone, but also the country's going through the worst drought in decades, so almost 40 years. So the harvest, I went to one place, their harvest completely failed. They had nothing. And normally, if that happened, they would get some work in construction, day labor, something, but that's all gone. There's nothing, no help in any way. So, and actually that place where the harvest had all failed, people there were either farmers or they worked in a military base. So the military base, of course, had closed, so or been taken over by the Taliban. So there was just everybody in the area had lost all their income, and as was said earlier, it's not just the poorest people. It's also, I met one family who they lived really comfortably. You know, one of them was a prosecutor, one of them was the manager of a translation agency, one of them was a professor at the university. They all lost their jobs overnight and had not expected it. And actually they'd just recently paid for a wedding, so they'd actually borrowed money. And suddenly they'd gone from a comfortable life to nothing. Those people, the day I was there, were sharing a cauliflower for the whole day, nothing else. The Fatima that I talked about earlier, from the people from Helmand, there was 30 of them living in this small compound, and they were sharing 8 pieces of bread a day. That was it, nothing else. It was freezing. Everybody was coughing. They were getting a few bits of paper and sticks from the street for their fire. It was so miserable. And so the father, Lalajan, had to sell Fatima because otherwise they would have starved to death. And so he'd sold her into marriage. And the day I went there, he'd tried to sell his 3-month-old baby girl as well. I mean, and the problem is, this isn't like some rare example. There are hundreds and thousands of people in the same situation. People are selling their kidneys, and people that work a lot there with child marriage. Child marriage is not something new there, but are saying to me that not only is it far more than they've ever seen before, but it's also much younger children. And so it's just hard to really describe how miserable the situation is. And the fact is, it's getting worse. And I'm worried, like everybody here, I think, that now with Ukraine, we're not very good either in the media or in the international community of focusing more than one thing at a time, that people will now forget Afghanistan. And Babar described how, you know, the big shortfall in aid that there is already. Now we need resources for Ukraine. Also, energy prices are going up, food supplies are affected by Ukraine, and that all really affects Afghanistan.
Well, I think, you know, all of us are here tonight because we care deeply about the situation there. And I wanted to, before we open up to questions and hear from all of you, your thoughts, I wanted to turn to Ilaha and hear more about this, the Uplift fund that you have founded in you know, in the aftermath of you know, the Taliban taking over in Afghanistan. And just, could you tell us about how sort of donors have engaged in the fund and how you're working with community and grassroots organizations and helping the sort of families and communities that Christina's referred to?
Absolutely. First of all, assalamu alaikum and hello to everybody. Thank you for having me. Hopefully I do justice for replacing Sahar Halimzai. My name is Ilaha Omar. I'm an Afghan American. I was born in Kabul and left at 40 days of age in a very similar fashion of how Afghan people have been fleeing the country in the past several months. I've been involved with grassroots aid work in Afghanistan for a bit over 25 years on my own capacity and volunteering for several grassroots nonprofit organizations. I was just there June and July of last year, where we launched a school for children with all types of disabilities in Kabul. 2 weeks later, after I left Afghanistan, Kabul fell. And like most people who have been engaged in Afghanistan in some capacity, I naturally fell into the evacuation of Afghan people and getting involved with Kabul airport and getting people through those crowds and through those airport gates, which was probably one of the most humiliating events in Afghan history. After that, I moved on to more evacuations out of Mazar, and at that point realized, took a step back and saw unfolding before me a de facto Taliban regime coming in and taking over Afghanistan with a horrible track record, a complete economic collapse, loss of jobs by the biggest employer, the government of Afghanistan, a cash crisis, a run on the banks, hyperinflation, millions of internally displaced, climate migration, sanctions, and probably the worst humanitarian disaster unfolding before us. So that was the impetus behind Uplift Afghanistan Fund when I realized it's time to set up a nonprofit that will connect with grassroots organizations in Afghanistan that are familiar with the day-to-day challenges of Afghanistan and how to get through these challenges. So the mission of Uplift is to connect with grassroots or community-led initiatives, to support them, to lean in on them and understand what are the needs, how are they assessing the needs, what is the most no harm effective way to approach aid work. And so we came up with 7 sectors of support: humanitarian relief, evacuations and resettlement, preservation of our culture, our art, our talent, inclusion of women, people with disabilities and minority communities, education, innovation, environment, where we realized these were all the sectors that we're going to need to put attention and focus on. Obviously, there are many, so right now the focus is humanitarian relief. And the thing that was important for us is that we want to create space for Afghan people and to lead and make decisions for Afghanistan. We created a lot of space for experts, Afghan experts, women experts, to make decisions, joint decisions. We vet our partners on the ground. We have a monitoring and evaluation team on the ground. We have a team of data scientists measuring the impact of aid. And what I truly believe is that where there are problems, there are opportunities. And now I know there's a plethora of crises unfolding at the same time, but it is also an opportunity to think about how to effectively deliver aid. So we strongly believe in connecting on the community level and village level. One of our partners is the CDDO or the CDC's Community Development Councils, and they're able to assess on a village level the needs and deliver aid on a village level. And so it's been going very well so far. Obviously, the need is very great, and the need for big players like UNHCR and Ilaha to continue their work, but also that we have a chance to do this right.
Thank you, Ilaha, for sharing that with us. And is there anything that people here in the room could do in terms of supporting your fund, and what has the response of people in the US, and maybe you're looking for supporters globally as well, what has the response been to the model?
So one of the impetus behind us is to create a safe channel for aid to be directed through. So like we're OFAC compliant, we work very closely with the US Treasury to make sure step by step we're following compliance. This makes donors feel very safe. I think Matt was talking about this earlier. The US Treasury is extremely encouraging of humanitarian aid to be delivered of Afghanistan. So they're making it very easier you would think with sanctions, but actually it's been quite straightforward to be compliant. Donors as such feel safe. There's a lot of private donors that are supporting us, some bigger foundations that are starting to support us. And I think that, first of all, having faith in Afghanistan and Afghan people that we'll get through this time is key. I hear a lot of rhetoric of, Afghanistan, it's been in conflict for so many years in this. It has been, but let's keep that faith that we will get through this time as well. We have gone through a tremendous amount. I think we can get through this. Creating space for Afghan-led initiatives, promoting civic engagement, really honing in on the talent we have left in country. I know we had a lot of brain drain, but we still have a tremendous amount of talent in country, and how to empower them, how to create space for them to lead and for us to support them from the back end. Basically giving them space and a seat at the table.
Thank you for sharing that uplifting message for all of us to feel empowered. I'd like to make some time for questions now, and I believe Christopher has a microphone, so please just raise your hand and he'll come over, and so that the panelists also who are joining us online can hear your question. We need to use the microphone.
First of all, thanks for everyone the panel tonight. It was really informative and enlightening. So thank you for that. My question is, how easy is it with the Taliban, dealing with the Taliban, and how easy are they making this for you? Thanks.
Maybe, Babar, would you like to take that question first, and then maybe Matt, turn it over to you?
Yeah, it's a good question. Not easy at all on any of those fronts. And also on their behalf, it's not easy. They're not well known in terms of governance. So you see them struggle in that sense. But when you try to engage, I mean, as it was mentioned, that now we have more access because there's no active conflict going on right now. So we have now more access to more districts, more provinces where you can go. But for them also, without any resources, so for people, when they need something, you go to the authorities who are in charge. You go to whatever places where there were administrators or governors or others to ask for help. So they attend to people. They give them a receipt, and then with that piece of paper, people think they will get something. The reality is that the majority of the officials or their ministries or departments, they don't have much to give to people. And then they turn to us in terms of, can you help all these people? I said, yes, we have. We say, yes, we have our own mechanism in terms of trying to find out, going from place to place, doing assessments in terms of needs and who needs it. For them, it's like whoever, I mean, when they bring the needs, they think the humanitarian community should just come forward the model they want us to follow. And I've been in some discussions where there's a lot of back and forth, and the way humanitarian community works in terms of assisting people, it's not the way they know, or it's not their way as per se. So we end up having these discussions, difficult discussions, but at some level you kind of find that they want humanitarian community to get more engaged, helping people. So that's there. But then, as it was mentioned, in terms of resources, how much we can bring into the country to assist people. And as Ilaha Jan was putting it, Afghanistan, in terms of its population and its people, its youth, what they were able to gain in the last 20 years, it was not easy after all those decades of what the country had already gone through. But you saw youngsters coming forward. You saw people who were going to universities, schools, and colleges, and you saw Afghans who were taking the lead in terms of running their day-to-day business. So that's why, I mean, as High Commissioner Filippo Grandi was recently there, and he kind of tried to make this point, that it's very important that what humanitarian engagements we have with them, where they're listening to us, we should not lose that opportunity in terms of pushing to also for rights and different things. I mean, to be a woman in Afghanistan, this is probably the most difficult time for Afghans that they are going through, not for ordinary Afghans, also for us as humanitarian workers. When the Taliban came, our female colleagues were not allowed to come and work side by side with us. And that was one of the points where we had to engage with them. So at the end, they were allowed, but still, it depends which location you are. So it's not an easy engagement at all.
Thank you for sharing that. Matt, did you want to add anything?
Well, I mean, I guess I would just say, the foundation has been, and the wider development network has been in the country for about 30 years, roughly, since 1996. And during the previous Taliban regime, and during that time, we have always maintained a posture of political neutrality and made it very, very clear that we're there for the people of Afghanistan. And so that was true for the places that were under government control or the places that were contested before, and there were many of them, of course, over the past 10 years. So in that sense, a lot of the new authorities are not that new, actually, because a lot of places where we work and other organizations are working actually already had, let's call it shadow authorities, or now you can't quite say de facto because that's the current government is the de facto government, but the point being is that they were there. So they knew us, actually. And I think what has always been important for us to come back to this point about working for communities, it was always the communities themselves that negotiated on our behalf. They negotiated access for us. We didn't have to go in and negotiate our own access. And the same thing was true following the fall in August. And so, for example, we had a facility where, as the provincial capitals were falling, we had a facility that had been ransacked. Some people had been beaten up and had some vehicles stolen. And the community went to the local Taliban the next day and said, "What are you doing? They've been here for this, X number of years. They do amazing work for us. You need to leave them alone." And so 2 days later, we had our vehicles back and an apology. I mean, that's shocking. You would never hear that. So and I don't say that in order to minimize the difficulties that there are in the country, but it's just to say that actually we have found a way of working with people and helping people themselves negotiate their space. And I think that's really important, and we shouldn't forget that that is absolutely still possible. There's a lot of fear about the new administration, which is understandable. But what we think we should be doing is focusing on helping people find their own space and accommodation in their communities.
Thank you, Matt. Other questions?
Yes, thank you for this very fascinating discussion. I was just wondering whether we have any perspective on how large the Afghan diaspora is, and whether the Afghan diaspora how it is engaged, how it is mobilized, whether there's support coming in, how it comes in. I asked this question because one of the things that struck me in East Africa, for example, is that a lot of the support that the East Africans got, in fact, the majority of the support they got, was from their own diaspora. It far outweighs international aid. So I'm just wondering if you have a perspective on the Afghan diaspora.
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. Ilaha, I wonder if that's something you might want to start, and then maybe Christina, I don't know if you have some thoughts on this as well. Ilaha.
Sure, yes, sure. Yes, there are millions of Afghans diaspora, most of whom are in Pakistan and Iran. But we have a strong base here in the Bay Area, in Fremont, for example, in Virginia. And I have to say, the current events have galvanized the youth, the diaspora youth. You have a tremendous amount of advocacy groups being set up, expert groups, a lot of lawyers coming in, working on policies, US, for example, resettlement policies. You have a lot of aid organizations raising funds, a lot of advocacy on sharing information because of the misinformation on social media. There are a lot of organizations really laying things out I see on Instagram and Twitter of what sanctions mean, or how can you help Afghan people? So I have never in the last 25 years of my life seen this amount of interest by Afghan diaspora than I have now. And I do think that they could make a huge dent in the reconstruction and the maybe human rights side advocacy for Afghanistan. Definitely, I'm hopeful.
Thank you. Thank you. That's great to hear. Christina, would you like to add to that?
Yeah,
Okay, thank you. Sorry, there's, I think, a virtual question from someone who's joining remotely.
Hi, we have a few virtual questions, so I'm going to round them up. But one of the questions was that previously there's been a lot of mismanagement of funding. So what are we doing this time round to ensure maximum and better results? We have another question for Ilaha. So you've emphasized the importance of Afghan-led initiatives in your talk. Could you tell us how this approach could give better results than collaborative initiatives in Afghanistan? And I'll leave that there.
Thank you. Matt, I wonder if you'd like to talk about the sort of management or mismanagement of funding question. And maybe, Babar, you'd have something to say about that as well.
I don't know that I have much yet. We're having trouble enough getting the money into the country, let alone spending it right now. I think how to put this delicately? I mean, I think, you know, the largest source of corruption, let me put it this way. The largest source of mismanagement, let's put it, was corruption. Under the last government for a couple of decades, it's been an endemic problem there. And it's something that the international community and others have tried to get to grips with. In, you know, our world, that is to say the NGO world, you know, we're not the source of that mismanagement. We have always emphasized not only the kind of financial transparency that we have to have in order to work in the country, but also, I think, making sure that the money gets closest to those who need it. So really I think those organizations that are working really at that grassroots level or at closest to those communities have a much better understanding and control over where money is going. But also, you know, at least in our programs, the communities themselves are able to monitor both government spending and our own spending. I guess that's a partial answer. I think right now there's an enormous new aid architecture that's going into the country right now that's really trying to be created overnight. I know it's something that colleagues at the UN are very concerned about. Probably Babar is better placed to talk about that than I am. But certainly from our side, we would be relying on the same kinds of things that we've done for a very long time to make sure that money and aid goes to the right place.
Babar, would you like to add your comments?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, it is a legitimate worry. I mean, whatever we have heard in the past and all the concerns. As far as the humanitarian assistance is concerned, you know, so our dealings directly with Afghans who need our assistance, and that has been there for the last 4 decades. The assistance which goes to the humanitarian community goes directly to Afghans, and you can see the impact in terms of how we are supporting. As Matt was saying, we don't have enough. The needs are so huge. And also on some of the development issues, and also salaries of teachers, salaries of health staff, to cover those, the UN overall and the humanitarian community has come forward with a plan, transitional plan, which can help. Because right now, I mean, you have people who have not been paid, who are engaged in day-to-day service provision, but they have not been paid for months and months. And that payment has to be with them as soon as possible. We are talking about doctors, health technicians. We are talking about teachers. We as UNHCR, during the last 20 years, as the 5 million former refugees that returned, one issue that we had, what were they returning to? So we were investing with the help of donors in the communities for basic infrastructure, from road, from services like providing clean drinking water, schools, hospitals. That everything, if you go around and you see, it's very kind of evident that investment has been made. It is there, and some of the currently displaced people are coming to those spots where we have done all these investments. I mean, one of the school that I visited my colleagues in Herat, we had a female teacher who was teaching girls in the first or second grade, because then the higher secondary girls were not allowed. We hope that with the announcement that was made, we would see everyone returning to school and educational institutions soon. So that teacher is going what we need to kind of how we can motivate work children to be in the class, and you know, how can they keep their focus. What she was not telling us that she hasn't at that stage been paid for 3-4 months, but they were still continuing it. So it's very important that engagement, as we try to keep repeating, that the humanitarian engagement has to be there. And then through that humanitarian engagement, we have to put in place a mechanism that everyone is confident that that help is directly reaching the Afghans that need it.
Thank you. Turning to the question about Afghan-led initiatives and projects, Ilaha, would you like to comment on that and how you see that as something that will deliver sustainable change and development?
Sure. So, and I love that question, actually, because we really seek to reclaim aid work as a conversation between equals. So our partners, our beneficiaries are truly our partners. And our donors have to have that same vision. I mean, the ultimate goal is not to make Afghan people reliant on aid, is to make Afghan people self-reliant, self-sufficient. And when you have this goal and you're working with your donors and your partners in an equitable fashion, that helps. Like I'll give you an example. One of our donors wanted to donate money for a rice silo in a rural village outside of Herat. We talked to our partners about this idea. Obviously, we're excited. We have a donor interested in this, but we realized through our partners that at this current moment, this was about 2 or 3 months ago, it wasn't the right time to build a rice silo in this very desperate state in Afghanistan in just one village, that it may cause more harm than do good. And so this is how I mean by keeping that conversation with our local partners, because they understand the challenges. You know, I work with a lot of, for example, female entrepreneurs in Afghanistan. And at first I thought as a Western person that I had the solutions to all the challenges. I quickly realized, actually, Afghan people have the solutions. We just have to give them the tools and the resources. And we incorporate monitoring and evaluation. We incorporate transparency measures. And this can all be done, especially with the use of technology in today's world.
Thank you, Ilaha. And I think that comment about Afghan people having the solutions and looking to us for support to help provide the tools and to develop those models and those initiatives that are going to restart the economy and revitalize communities is a really powerful one. And I think this evening we've been on quite a journey where we've talked with our panelists about the despair and the hardship in Afghanistan, and in some moments I think all of us felt very overwhelmed by what we heard. And at the same time, I think we've also felt inspired by the work that all of our panelists are doing, and thank you all for being part of that by supporting our organizations and our colleagues in that work. And I think hearing from all of you about that determination to overcome this very difficult time in the history of the country and having hope for the future of Afghanistan and the power of working together towards that and supporting the people. So thank you very much for being here this evening. Thank you very much to all our panelists. The reception is going to continue. I'm sorry that those of you joining us virtually won't be able to join us, but thank you for being part of the discussion, Babar and Ilaha. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Christina. And I will see you out in the reception. Thank you for being with us.